Okay, today what I want to talk about is the most paranoid subject of them all, world government. As we'll see, I take the question seriously, and the question I will ask then is there any instance that would correspond to this concept of world government? If so, what is that instance? Where would we locate it? How would we map it out? How would we grasp it? Not simply as a concept, but as a construct, an operational reality. And that can begin, let's say, here, in this place, which is a currently very active place, I suppose. Well, I think it's probably closed right now because it's in the US. It's actually located in Stamford, Connecticut, right in New York City. Largest securities trading floor in the world. A 103,000 square foot operation with a 40-foot arch ceiling, freeing it of columns or walls. The size of 3 football fields, it's home to 1,400 traders and staff who handle about $1 trillion worth of transactions a day. It's a UBS trading floor, and they boast of a 747 jet could turn around inside. This kind of thing, of course, exists in all the great financial centers of the world, not always this big. UBS is a Swiss bank, a very big one, yeah. But this is where the major action takes place on these kind of trading floors in banks and then also in stock exchanges. To describe the action that takes place there, I'm going to quote from an extremely provocative book, not a book that I believe in or recommend as a doctrine, but a book which I think is really kind of makes a shockingly lucid proposal about the world that we live in. And the author, David Westbrook, says this: political forms, such as the nation-state, are not immortal. From time to time, the primary form of political life, and with it, the grammar of politics, changes. Attempts to understand the way we now live rest, therefore, on a restatement of politics as it appears in the context of supranational capital, legitimated through our faith in the institutions of money and property, as opposed to the modern nation-state legitimated through the familiar mechanisms of the liberal republic. The communicative space formed by the financial markets is the object of political thought in our time. Obviously a very strong proposal, and indeed this guy wants to make an apology for global capitalism. In a time of discontent, he wrote it in the wake of the Seattle protests, at a time when financial capitalism came under very strong scrutiny in a way for the first time in sort of a broad way. And this guy tries to disengage the basic principles of finance capitalism and to suggest that there could be an ethics of these basic principles. Obviously, the point where I disagree is the idea that there could be an ethics. But let's look at what he says about the basic principles. He makes this observation: the supranational capital markets have joined many of the world's peoples and societies into a new polity, a single virtual metropolis. A trader can sit in Canada and deal in Poland, Thailand, South Africa, and Chile. The communicative space thereby established not only spans the globe, it establishes a cultural context. A seemingly simple order to buy stock in a company rests on a great deal of shared and legally enforceable culture. Contracts must be formed, the order must be cleared, payments must be made and accepted, accounts must be settled and agreed to, property rights and hence local control must be conveyed. Language, contractual obligation, institutional relation, money, accounting, property, and hence deeper matters like the past, the future, the individual, and the exercise of the will must be understood in similar ways. just for the deals to be made. As a result, this communicative space has become the frame of reference for those who care about money or the things money buys, and more broadly for those who care about politics, and more broadly still for those who care about the efforts to make sense of our time that we call culture, art, literature, religion, and such. For us, the world is a city of gold, a polity defined by the flow of capital, and that ancient dream to be a citizen of the world has become an everyday and not altogether comfortable reality. A very strong proposal. This is the kind of thing, for instance, that in France they really hate to hear. I mean, they hate this, you know. People will stand up in rage upon hearing this, you know, because of the, you know, dispossession of that familiar order of the Republic, right? However, there's something to it. There's something to this idea that a single culture is spread through the communicative space of the networks. And it's exactly that unification of the same way of doing things, of ordering society, that I want to examine genealogically today. Before getting into the genealogy, let's look at the present, and let's look at a map of this polity, of the city of gold. Such a map, this is such a map. It's the map of a network, the Hibernia Atlantic network that they call the global financial network. It's just one network, but this is a company, a cable provider, that has stretched cables to all these places, principally in Europe and the United States, with extensions to South America, just a few, and a surprisingly small number of extensions to Asia. But that's because it's just one company. There's more companies that do this. But they do this, you know, they do this very, very well, I guess. And if you notice here, they have a project which is now funded and is underway to put a new cable, which will be, I think, the fastest undersea cable in the world, which will stretch from New York to London, and which will allow those high-frequency traders whose desks I showed you yesterday in the introduction to have an increased advantage of a few milliseconds over the other traders. And of course, it's that kind of thing that gives rise to this record of message traffic, 121,257 messages per second, measured in 1 30-second period. So in a minute, you have almost 1 million messages flowing through the New York Stock Exchange. Wow. Where, of course, a lot of high-frequency trade is going on. Soon that will be able to happen transatlantically. Now, at the same time, I'm showing you a film. This is a bit of news media, a bit of financial news media, Reuters. A person sitting at their desk in any one of these spots will typically be watching this kind of thing out of the corner of their eye. They will be watching news about the world, and they will also be watching news about themselves. You see, the operations of managing capital flow is at once a self-reflexive operation where those involved look at themselves in their screens to see what their counterparts are doing all throughout these massive networks, and they look at the physical world, the flow of goods, key commodities like oil, which was the subject of this short Reuters spot, which was actually about the price of oil and the price of futures contracts on oil. It's futures contracts that were being traded in the NYMEX exchange in New York by these traders who actually carry their screens with them on their bodies. Something that gives us maybe deeper insight into this notion of the world on the screen. Now it's interesting to see that you can, they tell you that you can join the global financial network at any of the entry points below. In other words, to get into this, you have to go to very specific places. And by looking closely and comparing things, I found out that one of those specific places is the trading room that this picture I showed at the start, which is located at 677 Washington Boulevard in Stamford, Connecticut. Obviously, it's a big building with that big roof. And under that big roof you have not only 1,400 traders and staff, but also one of the points where another enterprise can connect to the Hibernian Atlantic network and thereby have access to this whole universe, this whole system of interconnection that is one set of the much larger system that constitutes the real totality of the global financial network. For that, you have to have infrastructure, you have to have cables. Of course, you need this sort of infrastructure, but you also need the superstructure of teams of traders, teams of programmers creating mathematical models, vast banking complexes providing the capital that allows these traders to juggle, up to, say, $1 trillion a day from a single trading floor, as in the case of the UBS floor in Stamford. And you'll notice that this so-called low latency cable goes right through Stamford on its way undersea to hit London. So, I mean, it's not there yet, they're building it right now.
Why don't they just use the internet?
Because they want it to be faster.
Yeah.
And they want it to be secure also.
Right.
Two reasons. It must be faster, it must have a very low margin of error, and it must be secure.
And priority,
Really?
property.
It's completely, I mean, these are dedicated networks, you cannot, this is not the internet here.
Right, but that is how the internet works.
This is a dedicated network, yeah.
It's the same concept. Like we tend to think about, like in the humanities, especially, we get this vision of the internet as this non-place, but it's absolutely connected like that.
Oh, of course, the internet is based on undersea cables in the same way that this is. And it's Hibernia. Did you have a question? No, it's fine.
No, I was looking for the English word for propriétaire.
Oh yeah, well,
it's okay. It's dedicated. It has to be
it's dedicated. Yeah, it's owned by this company, which is in the business of supplying this service to not only all these enterprises, but to many more that connect via these entry points to the network. It's interesting that you need to connect to that specific network, and in that sense, it is. There are those who are in and those who are out. It's a small number of people who play this game. Small by the standards of the world population, large if you consider that you can find 1,400 of them under a single roof. So it works, yes, like the internet, but it's not the global freewheeling, unencrypted internet that is such an open and extraordinary thing. It's very different from that. And there's also, it's interesting to know, and it's not shown on this map because it's not done by Hibernia Atlantic, there's a cable like this between New York and Chicago. So that the distance between New York and Chicago can be reduced to a few milliseconds. That's so that the high frequency traders in those two cities can trade on the markets between the CME, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and the New York Stock Exchange, or the NYMEX, or the other big markets, the NASDAQ, that are located in New York.
Maybe this is a very silly, stupid question, but if it's only a couple milliseconds that they're saving, correct? Doesn't it take time to interpret? Like, doesn't a choice have to be made, or is it just is it all algorithms and stuff?
For high frequency trading, it is now all algorithms. The trader and the programmer. You'll have a desk, and there'll be traders there who deploy the algorithms. And you also have programmers in case the algorithm needs to be adjusted during the course of the day. The trader's job now is to unleash the algorithm the way you would unleash a hunting dog. You don't exactly control the hunting dog, you let it go at a certain point. Similarly with the algorithm. These things operate now in milliseconds. They operate, I think, some 60 times, don't go beyond this, but I think it's something like 60 times faster than you can click a mouse.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point it's beyond, it's a question where, as Marx said in the Grundrisse, technology reaches a point where what he called general intellect reaches a point where the human operator merely surveys the operation of the automatic machine. I'm not sure that Marx could have, I think Marx could easily have imagined this happening at the speed of 62 of a few milliseconds, because Marx had an incredible imagination. Um,
How much of this is speculative?
how much of this is speculative? It's all speculative. What do you mean? It's just speculative. I mean, but one of the points that I want to make is that the speculative and the real are totally interconnected.
Okay.
It's, in a way, all speculative. But what that all speculative does is it convinces people all around the world, including maybe yourself, certainly yourself, because you're, well, I presume too much. You may have a little money in the bank. You have a bank account.
Sure.
It may be negative.
No, no.
Okay. In that case, you are involved because the bank is using your money to do this.
Thank you.
Those, yeah, sons of bitches. And by doing that, they do two things. They mainly just churn that money back and forth in periods of milliseconds. Like what they're saying here, you know, in this 1 second, these 121, 257 messages are orders placed, canceled, executed, and routed. Well, one thing that happens is they take the fact that they have your money in the bank and they use that high frequency trade to place an order which sends a signal, and then they cancel it before anyone can act upon it, and they use the information they gain by people's intention to act to determine where they have another advantage, and then they place that order, they execute it, and it's routed to the clearinghouse.
Yeah, you know, that's why some network hackers or network activists are organizing sometimes calls or sending calls for people to pick up the money from the account at the same time. Did you receive already this kind of calls? There are some tribes that are sending via some networks, and they ask like, hey, that day, everyone go to the
Yes.
ATM and pick all the money you have in your account at the same time, because
Like a run.
mostly of the money you have is virtual. It doesn't exist. It's really something that doesn't exist.
Yeah, well,
For real, it's just like.
well, let's be careful with saying that it doesn't exist. There's a complex relation between what exists and what doesn't. If there were no existence to all of this, it would not have the power that it does. There's first of all the existence of this vast network. There's second of all the existence of the oil that is whose futures are being traded. And all of that is what provides the environment within which the tremendous expansion of capitalism that we've seen since the 1990s does take place.
Yeah.
So although it's like saying language doesn't exist, but its non-existence
Yeah, well,
allows it to do so many things.
What
So
you
many
know
more
this
things than if it did exist.
Dead horse theory?
I don't know the dead horse theory.
I will look for it.
Okay.
But I think it's related to what kind of story, or is this a story? A Russian came here to Colombia, you know. Then he says, I have a hostel, and he asked me, he gave me $1,000, and he said, take this because next week I'm coming to your hostel, okay? So Paul, he come to my hostel, and he says, hey, you remember that you owe me $1,000 and I need it now. So I say, oh yes, Paul, then here you have the $1,000. So he goes and he buys something with that, and then again. So I don't have any more debts with him. Then he buys something, so he have computers or something to him. Then he got his money from him, and the other one has also $1,000. So now there is 1,000,
You mean a Ponzi scheme?
2,000, 3,000, 4,000.
This is called a
Then
Ponzi
the
scheme.
Russian came again to me and he says, like, you know, I decided I have to go. Finally I will not stay in your hostel. Can you bring me back the 1,000? And because I forgot to say that Lionel in all this come to my hostel and pay me staying in my hostel. So I have again 1,000 paid by him, and he got that 1,000 from him. So I have this 1,000, so I give him back the 1,000, and he goes to Russia. So what happened then? Here in Colombia, we have now, it was circulating money. He made something, he has an object, he has a service, also he has a service, and I don't have any more my debt with him. So it was $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, and
So this was
from
a good
1,000 that is not here in cash, there has been 4,000.
Well, and this is what happens, of course, in the financial markets, because you have, well, what they do with your money in the bank and your money in the bank is they, on the basis of that money, which is said to be real, they then borrow up to 25 or 30 times more money. So I think, if I understand your story correctly, it's going in this direction. I think we should try to look carefully at how that actually works, and of course we're going to be doing that. So I'll continue with this sort of introduction. Now, having seen this map, and having begin to broach the idea of this transnational community of people who are effectively loaning 1,000, 1,000, 1,000 to a degree multiplied by this extremely rapid time of transport, let's go back to the notion of the city of gold and look how it's developed. It's been developed by some anthropologists who became extremely interested in this book. And in this other book here, Frontiers of Capital, these guys, oh whoops, it's not even on the screen, a guy named Douglas Holmes, no relation to me, and another guy you may know, whose name is George Marcus, who is one of the founders of the self-reflexive anthropology that came out in that book, Writing Culture, Total Transformation of Anthropology in the late 70s and 80s. They picked up this idea from the City of Gold and developed it further. And I think the way that they developed it is very, very clear and tells a lot more about what Westbrook is trying to talk about. They are going to give a historical explanation of the acts of these four figures. John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, first of all, who were the major negotiators for the Bretton Woods Treaty in 1944 in the United States at the end of the Second World War, when the monetary order of the post-war period was negotiated. And these two figures, Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman, who are, well, Jean Monnet is the major ideologist of the European Union, and Schuman was the prime minister of the time, and the two cooperated to launch the European Union, which they went on to help develop, particularly Monet throughout his entire life. So, Holmes and Marcus say this. They say both Monet and Keynes experienced World War II from within the bureaucracies and ministries that managed, supplied, and financed the war efforts. Both were, in fundamental ways, economic nationalists and liberal internationalists, and to say the least, they both had a critical understanding of the workings of the financial markets, particularly Keynes, who attributed the Great Depression to the excessive circulation of capital. What they sought, however, was a deployment of markets to achieve a profound historical transformation. They sought, through the European and Bretton Woods institutions, to create an integrated world economy that, to paraphrase the now famous words of the Schuman Declaration establishing the European project, would make war between nation-states not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. In other words, they used supranational markets as a political tool to eviscerate, that means takes the guts out of, the nation-state, to eviscerate it of its economic sovereignty, and hence what they understood to be its most rapacious proclivities as personified by Adolf Hitler. In its place, in place of the economic sovereignty of the nation-state, they created a politics of a distinctive sort, a politics that for very intriguing reasons never gained expression as a wide-ranging political rhetoric. Rather, it operated as a deeply subversive technocratic discourse that transformed the world in the second half of the 20th century. Their veiled efforts were aimed at achieving, in Keynes' word, a new order, a realizable utopia. The negotiation between Keynes and Harry Dexter White yielded the now famous tripartite Bretton Woods institutional arrangement for global financial integration. In other words, they yielded the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and then later the General Agreement on Tariffs of Trade. That was supposed to be called the International Trade Organization, but the Bretton Woods negotiations actually did not succeed, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, which later became the WTO, was instead negotiated in the United Nations. So this is the tripartite Bretton Woods institutional arrangement. And I'll talk more about that later. The key thing of this arrangement was to stabilize the exchange of world currencies, to give what we don't have now, that is to say, a stable exchange rate between all the participating nations. Exactly what we don't have in Switzerland right now, where the franc is out of control. What is most significant for our purposes is how these complex negotiations define the space, this map space that's on the wall now, of technocratic intervention predicated on monetary issues. Robert Skidelsky, who has written a biography of Keynes, makes these comments. The technical debates were not merely a cover for national self-interest. Keynes and White were both interested in theory and in finding technical solutions to technical problems. Economics often enables political conflicts which seem intractable if carried on in the language of politics to be bypassed by assuming, or the cynic would say, pretending, that they can be reduced to the technical and imposing a language of debate consistent with that assumption. So what's being said here is that a different language of politics, a technocratic, and economic language is being imposed in place of the traditional languages of sovereignty. This again is a very bold claim. It says that a space is being created covertly in a language that the people who will be governed by those inhabiting that space do not understand. As though the deliberations of the Congress or of the Chambre des Députés or of, the European Parliament were taking place in a language that none of the inhabitants understand. And in fact, this seems to be the case. This conceptualization of a supranational institutional framework also defined the role of a new class of actors, symbolic analysts, whose interests were no longer fully aligned with or reducible to those vested interests that defined the nation-state. These actors were no longer constrained by the nation-state's theories, methods, and histories. Indeed, by virtue of their institutional projects, they sought to render the intellectual apparatus underwriting the nation-state increasingly irrelevant. Keynes and Dexter White. Then we move to the other example, which is the European Union. An explicit ethos and practice, designed by Monet, was embraced by the founders of the European Union and used to fill this technocratic space of Europe. At its philosophical core were a comprehensive rejection of the nation-state as an instrument for managing human affairs and the development of an expert method, an administrative science of the supranational that would impel the political integration of Europe. The founders of the EU were emphatic that their goal was to escape the blighted history of the European nation-state and to create a new grammar and semiotics of society. That's a very well-written phrase, a new grammar and semiotics of society. That means that you have new rules, but you also have new contents, new words. These new words are actually forms of money, mathematical figures. So both a new grammar, a new set of rules, and a new vocabulary, a new set of contents. New grammar and semiotics of society. Thus, the dynamism of this new regime incites change that unfolds largely outside the conceptual ambit and political control of actors within the nation-state. Change that transpires largely unobserved or measurable from the perspectives of conventionally situated politicians, journalists, academics, and intellectuals. This is something that I'm not sure if it was discussed so much in North America, to some extent. But this was discussed a lot in Europe. because in the last 20 years in Europe we lived through the culmination of this long historical process, and not large masses of people, but many intellectuals became aware that politics had been displaced from the national theater and had been cast in a language that was impenetrable to anyone but the European technocrats. And so this was discussed quite a lot. Still, when I read it formulated this way by these people, this is one of those things where I started to read it on Amazon and read it and copy it and sneak into it in every way so that I could read the whole thing, because I was shocked. I was fascinated by this passage because it was so clear, because it expressed in a few words exactly what people spent years in the course of the 1990s, and then again when we were supposed to ratify the project for a European constitution, and it wasn't ratified, and so on and so on. So the analysis there is very sharp, very deep, and I think right on. As I say, nonetheless, it isn't something that entirely escaped people's attention, because it's something that's been going on for a long time. Look at this map. This is a map which was delivered. It was apparently made in 1942. There's a copy of it in the Library of Congress. It's a fascinating thing. It claims to be an outline of the post-war New World, or New World Order. And what it shows is a rationalization of the planetary space. You have, of course, the United States, but you also have the United States of South America. You have the Union of African Republics. You have the United States of Europe. You have the Union of Soviet Republics, the Union of Republics of China. I can't actually read this one. They do keep the old term for the Commonwealth. And then there's a whole program there. Now this map is so much like the right-wing conspiracy theories about the New World Order. The reason why is because at that time, during the Second World War, there was a tremendous amount of planning being done in the United States to effectively create a new world order. And it's amazing to read this quote from Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, in a book which is actually an anthropology of the military, because everyone was drafted into the effort of the Second World War, where she says we must see this war as the prelude to a greater job, the restructuring of the culture of the world. This is a huge, huge turning point. You can find many quotations like that. I've only given two. Henry Murray, an important psychologist who drafted, this technique for profiling world leaders, which was initially used on Hitler to establish the psychological profile of Hitler, and now is used conventionally in politics and also in corporate strategy all the time. And he writes to Louis Mumford, the kind of behavior that is required by the present threat, that is it's now the Cold War, because this is just after the Second World War, involves transformations of personality such as never occurred quickly in human history. One transformation being that of national man into world man. And Murray, in his work for the profile of Hitler, makes remarks of much the same tenor, where he inquires as to how Germany could be, how the German population could be transformed away from its symbolic fixation on the figure of the leader. And he says that in order to achieve this transformation in the social psyche of the German population, one must install something much that transcends any individual, and what he suggests is, of course, world government. So this is something that, if you look in the historical record, you find, there was the United Federalist movement. There still exists a world passport, which was one of the projects at the time, which was actually, you can get one, you can apply for one and get one, even though it doesn't have validity anywhere. There was a very, very strong movement towards world federalism, and there was a World Federalist Congress and organization and so on. So these ideas came out of the horrors of the Second World War as a response to the threats of continued nationalism, and these ideas laid the basis for this gradual emergence of a new financial order, which in a certain way fulfills some of, but not all, of the goals of what would have been world government. Now those ideas were forgotten. They were then forgotten, but with the upsurge of the financial sector in the 1990s, they appeared again. and people on both the right and the left began to critique these things. So, we had experienced this, the enlargement of Europe, this sort of massive enlargement to a huge free trade bloc, from this thing in 1957. Gradually, it was really when it hit 1986, the Single European Act, and then this big enlargement in 95 and 2004. Well, this was very striking, and it was so striking that I worked with a group of artists to create this map, because we wanted to create a consciousness of what was going on before our eyes and in our lives. And this consciousness that we wanted to create was the consciousness of the way a new world was being produced according to the European norms. So what we did was simply, very simply, to map out all the connections of the formal structure of the European Commission with all its directorates and that, and then critically to throw in a few things like the American Chamber of Commerce, a huge influence, groups like Burson Marsteller, actually a very important PR firm that operates in Brussels. We tried to connect, this, of course, to elements like the European Central Bank. We tried to do a lot of things. But what we were really, the basis of it was just to put on paper the structure of the European Commission and to show how it covers the entirety of one's lived experience and tends to standardize and normalize that lived experience. Okay, so we made 7,000 copies and handed them out in the street, during the European Social Forum that took place in Florence in 2002. The group, it's an artist group, it's called Bureau d'Etudes, went on to create this map, where they proposed a map of world government. We had done a lot of arguing about this sort of thing. I convinced them that they really had to include things like the major business schools. So they didn't do things like that. They made hypotheses, placing, the United States in relation with England, Israel, India, placing Japan over here, placing China sort of off to the side, and then here a European pole. They've analyzed dozens and dozens of types of firms, supranational institutions, national institutions, secret services, secret societies, and so on and so on and so on. Just a second, I'll finish this and then you formulate your remark.
Not a remark.
Precisely. And so I found this very, very interesting, and it spurred me on to try to analyze, actually, try to figure out how, you have to obviously get up close and look at it to even read the words, but when you do, you say, here's something else I know nothing about, right? But the effect of these sort of things was exactly the effect described by Frederick Jameson when he says conspiracy, one is tempted to say, is the poor person's cognitive mapping in the postmodern age. It is the degraded figure of the total logic of late capital, a desperate attempt to represent the latter's system whose failure is marked by its slippage into sheer theme and content. In other words, Jameson is saying that what is needed is to somehow map out the world system. And it cannot be achieved on the single level of theme and content, because that will always escape because it's too big. And so usually what happens is people will focus in on one thing and say, this is the center of the conspiracy. Or if they, in this case, he would probably say, yes, but it's too big, no one can know all that. And so Jameson's great, challenge in the 80s was to point to the incapacity of our minds, at least at present, he said, to map out the great global multinational and decentered communicational network in which we find ourselves caught as individual subjects. This was a very strong challenge. It was emitted in the early 1980s. 1982 is the date. And yet, I think that now that an entire generation has actually grown up in this great decentered, multinational communicational network and been caught in that subject, I think that we're actually arriving to a point where we can map out this transnational space. And I think what needs to be done to do that is precisely to establish a genealogy before trying to establish the spatial picture. Because I think that without the historical genealogy, it is in fact impossible to establish the spatial picture. And indeed, what I presented yesterday, this analysis of 4 different fields of contemporary global capitalism, is meant to be done at least twice. That is to say, as I indicated yesterday, you must first do it on Keynesian Fordism, and you must second do it on neoliberal informationalism. Because it's very clear that even if Keynes and Dexter White and Monet and Schumann laid the basis for something like a world government of finance, that did not come into being until the middle 70s, and especially more recent times, starting with the end of the Cold War and the globalization rush of the 1990s. So the process that's described in City of Gold and that's described by Holmes and Marcus is an incipient process. It begins in the post-war period, but it only comes to fruition in the period of neoliberalism or of neoliberal informationalism, when the technology is there for it, when the geopolitics, the geopolitical structure has changed and made that possible. So if those changes had not happened, if history had been different, maybe these plans that were laid at the time of the Second World War would have gone nowhere, would not have become what they did become. The fact is that they did. And so if we want to achieve the cognitive mapping that Jameson calls for, I think we have to do 2 things. The first one is the genealogical approach. The second one, therefore, a diachronic approach. And the second one is the spatial approach, therefore, a symbolic approach. We look at the development of the system and then the operation of the system. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to do what, in a way, I already did in the text of flexible personality. We're going to look at the development of the system. And then tomorrow we'll look at the operationality of the system, and then in the last days we'll look at the critique of the system. Okay, so this is a place where it would be good if there are some questions.
The only thing I want to ask is if you can email that, the complex world, you know what I'm talking about, the one diagram.
The world government.
Exactly.
Yeah, you can look on the internet and find a bureau d'études, and you can get a copy of that.
Oh, cool.
I mean, it's good enough to use. It's not as it's black and white one, but yes, look on their website, bureau d'études, or just I think it's the best way. But I will try to put it. Later I'll bring you the key with all the archives in there. So if I remember.
Oh, sure.
They are heavy, those PDF.
Yeah, that's why I want to put it on the stick, so you can put it directly in your computer.
Sir, if I can just jump in.
I have some
Sometimes
more.
if you want to give me the stick, and then I'll copy it onto mine, and then for the remainder of the
Yeah.
I'm curious, so everybody has a little more time.
I will do that.
And also, if there's anybody else in the other classes who wants to go, just have them see me.
Yeah, I'll bring it
So that you
tomorrow.
don't have to.
I'll bring it tomorrow. That's perfect.
Perfect.
Could you go back to the first quotation by Jameson about conspiracy?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great quote. Yeah.
I missed part of it, but I also want to ask a question about it.
Perfect.
The question has to do with this idea of cognitive mapping of Jameson's, but also mapping in general and its relationship to 2 threads. One is the development of ideograms prior to and after the war, especially in Austria and Germany, and also relative to informatics and the diagramming of sort of the overabundance of data that exists out there. One of them seems to illustrate the mechanism of control that might try to organize things even from the mind of a, what did he say, the poor person's cognitive mapping, which reads kind of like a, radical then
Kaczynski.
the other one, exactly, then the other one is like the, kind of the artist's attempt to, trudge through whatever this mess is that is data and connectivity. So my question is about the instrument of power at work inside of that. Is one of them truly revolutionary and the other one oppressive, or are they both and?
Well, I think that I personally think everything is both and. And I'm going to try to get a little more deeply into these questions with Felix Guattari, whose entire work is geared towards answering those questions. What you're talking about, I believe, you're talking about the development of like graphic symbols. Holland was also very productive of this. Symbols, you see this in Europe all the time. You don't need words anymore because it's a trans-linguistic space. And so the idea is to create flow, indicators of flow. Push here, open this way, do this. There's vast number of those. And of course that's a process of abstraction that's meant to manage, indeed. These are basically, indeed, managerial tools. And to the sense that they are managerial tools, they are pragmatic facts of life. We do live in society. To imagine a vast society like this one, developed to the point where it is, without any of these things, try to imagine it. It's very difficult. It involves a lot of mayhem, death, and murder, starvation, and many things. So this is some kind of necessary evil, which is at certain points really evil, and really destructive. And so the both and becomes the question of how do you deal with the necessary abstractions that constitute civilization when one of their effects is to wipe you out as a subject and to make you into a function. This is the basic question that I'm trying to bring forth here, and indeed this is the basic question that I think many people in the 1960s and onward began to confront when the extent of the rationalization of society became clear. It had not yet reached this point, but you could have drawn a similar map of any of the big nation states in the year 1970, and you would have been confronted with the same terrifying rationalization, and indeed that's how many people saw it, because that's exactly what happens to civilizations, and especially one as complex and as technical as the present civilization. So indeed, I think that's the basic question that's at stake here, and I am going to try to go further with that, but unlike most theorists, I'm going to go a bit slowly, because before getting to those questions, I would like to try to open the black box, rather than just naming it with a simple name. We were earlier talking about the spectacle. I think that perhaps an intellectual should go a little further than that, should look more deeply inside to all the different managerial techniques and begin to discover and invent some new concepts to name them after having understood at least as much as possible. There are barriers. For instance, mathematics. My lack of mathematics limits me all the time, It's an unfortunate thing. But there are many, many barriers. The extent of the knowledge that you need. To just even know, when you get close, you can read the letters on that, but then you become aware that something exists, but just knowing that it exists means that you have, years of work. Actually, this map caused me a decade of work, which isn't over yet. It's the last couple of years to go. But that's a strong effect of a piece of art if it causes you to engage in a decade of work. I think it's actually been a very valuable decade for me, and perhaps I can share some of that, and I've been trying to do so for the last few